Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. There's a story that has circulated online for years about a nightclub in Ukraine that operated in a low basement-style space and reportedly had access to old underground catacombs beneath the town. The way the story is usually told is dramatic and horrifying. It describes a rave, a young woman separating from her friends, wandering into underground tunnels while intoxicated, becoming lost, and later being found dead days afterward from exposure and dehydration. It often includes mention of a disturbing photograph. Before going further, it's important to say something clearly. Many versions of this story have been repeated on forums and social media without reliable sourcing. The details shift from telling to telling. Locations change. Names are rarely provided. The catacombs are sometimes described as historic tunnels, sometimes as abandoned infrastructure. Like many urban legend stories that circulate online, the core idea may be based loosely on real risks, but the dramatic specifics are often exaggerated or unverified. That said, the underlying scenario of someone entering underground tunnels while intoxicated and becoming disoriented is not impossible. Ukraine, like many European countries, has extensive underground systems in certain cities. Some are historical catacombs, others are drainage systems, old military bunkers, storage tunnels, or unfinished construction spaces. In places like Odessa, for example, vast underground networks exist and are known to be complex and dangerous without proper guidance. Underground spaces can be extremely disorienting even for sober, prepared people. They are dark, cold, and often lack clear pathways. Sound behaves strangely. Temperatures drop significantly below ground level, even in warmer seasons. Without light and direction, it becomes easy to lose track of orientation within minutes. If someone intoxicated were to wander into such a space alone, the risks would multiply quickly. Alcohol impairs judgment, balance, and spatial awareness. In a maze-like underground system, even a short wrong turn can lead someone far from any recognizable exit. Panic can set in. Panic leads to poor decisions, moving deeper instead of retracing steps, conserving no energy, wasting precious hydration. Exposure is also a major factor underground. Even if outdoor temperatures feel mild, subterranean areas remain cold and damp. Hypothermia does not require snow or ice. In cool, wet conditions, body temperature can drop gradually. Combined with dehydration, high confusion increases. A person may become disoriented, sit down to rest, and never regain enough clarity to find a way out. Many online retellings of this story describe the woman's friends as continuing to party, only raising concern days later. While that detail adds emotional weight, it's important to recognize that in real-life situations, timelines are often more complicated than simplified internet narratives suggest. People at large events can lose track of each other briefly without immediately assuming something is wrong, especially if phones are lost, signals are weak underground, or miscommunication occurs. As for the description of the body being found days later, decomposition can vary depending on environmental conditions. In cold underground spaces, certain parts of the body may preserve differently than others. Clothing and footwear can remain intact, while exposed skin decomposes. Moisture, insects, airflow, and temperature all influence how remains change over time. But graphic details shared online are often sensationalized, especially when paired with infamous photo claims. There have been numerous cases globally, not just in Ukraine, where people have entered caves, tunnels, abandoned structures, or industrial spaces and become lost. Search and rescue teams consistently warn about the dangers of entering such places without proper training and equipment. Even experienced explorers carry lighting backups, mapping tools, and safety lines. The reason stories like this spread widely is because they tap into something deeply unsettling. The idea of being alone in the dark, trapped beneath the ground, unseen and unheard. It plays on primal fears of isolation and confinement. Add the setting of a nightclub, a place associated with music, lights, and energy, and the contrast becomes even more dramatic. One moment is loud and crowded, the next is silent and underground. But it's worth separating verified history from internet folklore. If such an event occurred, there would likely be documented reports from local authorities, media coverage, and confirmed identities. Many viral versions of this story do not provide those. That lack of specifics is often a sign that the tale has evolved through repetition. Underground urban exploration carries real risks. In Eastern Europe especially, abandoned industrial spaces and old tunnel systems can be extensive and poorly marked. Some cities actively restrict access because of past accidents. Falling debris, unstable floors, toxic gases, and flooding are real hazards in addition to disorientation. Freezing and dehydration can indeed claim someone's life within days under the wrong conditions. The human body depends on stable temperature and hydration levels. Without water, cognitive function declines rapidly. In cold environments, the body burns energy trying to stay warm, accelerating exhaustion. A combination of confusion, fatigue, and darkness can prevent someone from making rational survival decisions. It's also important to acknowledge the emotional layer often added to this story. The idea that her friends continued partying. Stories told online frequently emphasize perceived betrayal or indifference to heighten the tragedy. In reality, missing person timelines are rarely so clear-cut in the moment. Large events are chaotic. People separate and reunite frequently. Concern sometimes builds gradually, not instantly. If there truly was a case of someone becoming lost in underground catacombs after leaving a nightclub, it would serve as a serious reminder about safety rather than just horror. Underground systems are not extensions of party venues. They are complex, often dangerous environments. Even sober individuals can misjudge how far they've gone. The psychological impact of darkness is also underestimated. In total darkness, without consistent light, the brain begins to misinterpret space. Sounds echo unpredictably. A hallway can feel longer than it is. Turning around may not feel the same as retracing steps. Within minutes, panic can override memory. When stories like this circulate with disturbing imagery attached, they often shift from cautionary tale to shock content. The graphic nature becomes the focus instead of the practical lesson. Do not enter unlit, unfamiliar underground systems alone. It's understandable that the image described, upper body decomposed more than lower body, sticks in people's minds. But decomposition is not supernatural. It is biological and environmental, and viral, infamous photos are frequently misattributed or taken from unrelated incidents. Ultimately, whether this exact version of the story is fully accurate or partially urban legend, the core takeaway remains grounded in reality. Underground spaces are hazardous. Intoxication increases risk dramatically. Losing track of friends in large, dark environments can escalate quickly. If anything, stories like this should encourage safer behavior. Stay with trusted people at large events. Communicate clearly if leaving an area. Avoid exploring unknown spaces while impaired, and treat underground structures with the seriousness they require. The idea of someone alone beneath a city while music continues above is haunting. But the real-world dangers involved are practical, not paranormal. Darkness, cold, dehydration, and confusion are enough. When reading or sharing stories like this, it's wise to pause and ask, is this verified, or has it grown through repetition? Tragedies deserve accuracy, not embellishment. And cautionary lessons are more useful when grounded in fact rather than shock. If you're ever in an unfamiliar city with underground tunnels, catacombs, or abandoned spaces, remember that those places were not designed for casual entry. Even in daylight, with a map, they can be confusing. At night, without equipment, they can be deadly. The safest approach is simple. If you don't know where a tunnel leads, don't enter it. Even one wrong turn can be far more serious than it looks from the outside. A few years ago, in the town where I live, there was a story that spread quickly through the community and stayed with many of us. It involved the owner of a local home health care agency, someone people knew and respected. She was not a reckless person. She was a professional, a mother, and someone who had built a successful business from the ground up. That is part of why the story is so unsettling. It did not happen to someone who seemed careless or irresponsible. It happened to an ordinary family on vacation. She had decided to take a trip to Florida with her husband, their 16-year-old daughter, and her daughter's close friend, who was also 16. It was meant to be a fun getaway. The girls had been looking forward to it for weeks. Sun, beach, boardwalks, and a break from school. Everything about the trip started off normally. They checked into their hotel, explored the area, and did the typical vacation activities. The weather was good. The atmosphere was lively. There was nothing unusual about any of it. A few days into their trip, they were walking along a busy boardwalk near the water. It was one of those places filled with energy. Families strolling with ice cream cones, music playing from small shops, people advertising boat tours and water sports. The girls had their hearts set on jet skiing. They were excited and impatient. They did not want to wait. They approached several legitimate companies along the boardwalk, asking about rentals. Most of the businesses told them they were fully booked for the day, but could schedule them for the next morning. The parents were fine with that. Waiting until the next day seemed reasonable. But the girls were teenagers, full of energy and eager for something fun right then and there. As they continued walking, two Hispanic men approached them and said they could take them out immediately. They claimed they had availability and could get them onto jet skis without the wait. In a crowded tourist area with dozens of vendors offering similar services, nothing about that offer immediately stood out as suspicious. They looked normal. They dressed like other boat operators. They spoke confidently and casually. The only small detail that raised concern was that they initially suggested taking just the two girls. They said they would bring them out in their speedboat to a location where the jet skis were kept. The parents quickly insisted they would all go together. That part is important. The parents did not simply hand their daughters over. They made it clear they would join them. So all four of them climbed into the speedboat with the two men. The boardwalk noise faded as the boat pulled away from shore. At first, it still felt like a normal excursion. Speedboats are common in those areas. The water was open and wide. The city skyline slowly grew smaller behind them. But after some time, things started to feel wrong. They kept going farther out into open water. It was longer than expected. The men were not explaining where they were headed. They were not making small talk. They were quiet, focused only on steering the boat farther and farther away from the land. The family began to exchange subtle glances. At first, it was just mild discomfort. Maybe the jet skis were anchored farther out than usual. Maybe this was part of the route. But as minutes turned into what felt like too long, the mood shifted. The girls started to look scared. The parents could sense it. The men remained stone-faced. No reassurance, no casual conversation. Just the sound of the engine and the growing distance from shore. That is when instinct began to take over. Without drawing attention to themselves, each of the four family members took out their phones. They did not make it obvious. They quietly began texting loved ones. They shared their location. They described where they were and who they were with. They tried to remain calm so the men would not suspect anything. The girls were crying quietly by this point. The parents were trying to stay composed. When you are in the middle of open water with no other boats nearby, it is a deeply vulnerable feeling. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to step off. You are entirely dependent on the people controlling the boat. The mother made a decision that may have saved their lives. She texted emergency services. She explained the situation in short, clear messages. She shared their live location and described the boat and the two men operating it. She did this without causing a scene, without accusing the men directly. She simply reached out for help. The boat continued farther into the open sea. At some point, it slowed down. The tension inside that boat must have been overwhelming. The family had already accepted, in their minds, that something was seriously wrong. Then the two men did something that confirmed their worst fears. They put on masks. Not simple face coverings, but masks with skull designs. It was a moment that probably felt surreal. Everything that had been an uneasy suspicion suddenly became real danger. The open water, the silence, the distance from shore. It all clicked into place. But just as the situation reached its peak, something else happened. Several Coast Guard and police boats appeared. They surrounded the speedboat quickly and efficiently. Officers shouted commands. The two men were apprehended on the spot. The family was pulled to safety and escorted back to the mainland. Later, authorities told them how close they had come to something far worse. The two men were suspected sex traffickers. Their method had reportedly been used before. They would approach young tourists on busy boardwalks, offer exciting activities without a wait, and isolate them on the water. According to law enforcement, and the plan had likely been to shoot the parents and abduct the girls, the family was told they were extremely fortunate. Others, they were informed, had not been as lucky. That is the part of the story that stays with me. Not just the danger itself, but how ordinary the setup was. It happened in broad daylight in a crowded tourist area. The men did not look suspicious. They did not act aggressively at first. They blended in. They looked like any other small tour operators trying to earn business. It is easy to sit back and point out the red flags afterward. Agreeing to a ride from someone not clearly connected to a known company. Getting into a boat without verifying credentials. Allowing distance from shore without a clear explanation. In hindsight, it seems obvious, but in the moment, on vacation, surrounded by people, with the sun shining and teenagers excited, the situation did not scream danger. That is what makes it so frightening. Predators do not always look like villains. They often look normal. They speak calmly. They smile. They offer convenience. They understand that tourists are relaxed and eager for adventure. They rely on that mindset. What also stands out is how quickly technology made a difference. The ability to send a live location, to quietly contact emergency services, to communicate without alerting the suspects. That small window of opportunity changed everything. As a parent myself, I think about this story often. My daughter sometimes tells me I am too protective. She says I worry too much. I remind her of this incident not to scare her, but to explain why caution matters. The world is full of wonderful experiences. Travel can be beautiful. Adventures can be life-changing. But it only takes one decision to step into something dangerous. What terrifies me most is not just what almost happened. It is how easily it could have happened. How quickly things shifted from a sunny boardwalk to open water isolation. How normal it all seemed at the start. That family went on vacation, expecting memories of laughter and jet skis. Instead, they came home with a story that still makes people pause when they hear it. They were lucky, incredibly lucky. And sometimes, luck comes down to a single, quiet text message sent at the right moment. In the late 1950s, Chino Hills, California, was still a quiet rural area. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. Citrus groves and open land stretched for miles, and crime was not something most families thought about often. That sense of safety was shattered in 1958 by a crime so brutal that it stayed in local memory for generations. One night, an escaped prisoner from the nearby Chino Hills Penitentiary broke into a family's home. The prison itself was not far from residential areas, which made the idea of an escape especially frightening for people who lived nearby. According to accounts passed down over the years, the man entered the house while the family was asleep. Inside were the parents, their children, and one of the children's friends who was staying over for the night. What happened next was horrific. The intruder attacked the family with a knife. One by one, he murdered them in their own home. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. There was no time for anyone to escape or call for help. In a small, peaceful town, something unthinkable had just taken place behind closed doors. But what makes the story even more disturbing is what reportedly happened afterward. Instead of fleeing immediately, the killer stayed inside the house. He used it as a hiding place. The bodies remained there, scattered through the home. The idea that someone could live among the aftermath of such violence is difficult to comprehend. Yet that is what people in the community came to believe had happened. There was one survivor. One child managed to live through the attack in a way that almost feels impossible. During the assault, the child was stabbed and left for dead. At some point during the chaos, they fell in a way that caused their body weight to press against the wound. That pressure slowed the bleeding. It was not planned. It was not intentional. It was pure chance. But it made the difference between life and death. The child eventually lost consciousness and slipped into a coma. When authorities later discovered the crime scene, they found this one small sign of life among the tragedy. The child was rushed to the hospital and somehow survived. For a town like Chino Hills, the crime felt overwhelming. It was not just the loss of multiple lives. It was the violation of the feeling of safety that people had relied on. Neighbors who once felt comfortable began locking doors and checking windows at night. Parents worried about their children in ways they had not before. Years passed, And like many old crimes, details faded into rumor and retelling. Then, decades later, another case in the same area brought new attention and controversy. Kevin Cooper was accused in a separate but equally shocking family murder case in Chino Hills in 1983. The crime involved the Ryan family, and like the earlier case, it shook the community deeply. Kevin Cooper had escaped from a minimum security prison near the area before the murders. He was later arrested, tried, and convicted. He was sentenced to death. From the beginning, he maintained his innocence. Over time, questions began to surface about the evidence used against him. DNA testing became more advanced in the years after his conviction, while supporters argued that some of the forensic evidence was flawed or mishandled. Modern DNA tests were conducted, but results were described as inconclusive. Instead of providing clear confirmation of guilt or innocence, they raised more questions. The surviving child from the Ryan family case later made statements suggesting that Kevin Cooper might not have been involved. That added even more doubt for those who believed the investigation may have focused too heavily on Cooper while overlooking other possibilities. The case drew national attention. Advocacy groups, legal experts, and even celebrities became involved. Kim Kardashian publicly supported efforts to review the case and called for further examination of the evidence. She even attempted to bring the case to the attention of President Donald Trump during his time in office, seeking possible exoneration or clemency. For a small community, the situation felt surreal. A town once known for its quiet, rural life became linked to one of the most debated criminal cases in California history. People who had grown up hearing about the original 1958 murders now watched as modern, legal battles unfolded decades later. What makes these stories so unsettling is not only the violence itself, but the lingering uncertainty. When evidence is questioned, and new technology challenges old conclusions, it forces communities to confront the possibility that justice may not have been fully served. It also reopens wounds for families who have already endured unimaginable loss. In cases like this, emotions run deep on all sides. Some people are convinced the original conviction was correct. Others believe serious mistakes were made. Legal experts debate forensic methods. Activists call for transparency. Meanwhile, the memory of the victims remains at the center of it all. Small towns often carry stories like this for generations. Children grow up hearing about the house where something terrible happened. Parents use the story as a reminder to be careful. Neighbors still remember where they were when they first heard the news. The idea that someone could escape prison, enter a family's home, and destroy so many lives is frightening on its own. The idea that questions still linger decades later makes it even more complicated. Justice is supposed to bring closure. When doubt remains, closure feels incomplete. For people outside California, these cases may seem like distant headlines, but for those who live nearby, they were real. They changed daily life. They altered how safe people felt in their own homes. It is easy to look at crime stories and focus only on the dramatic details. The escaped prisoner, the lone survivor, the controversial conviction, the celebrity involvement. But at the heart of it all are families whose lives were torn apart. Whether discussing the 1958 murders or the later Kevin Cooper case, the core truth remains the same. Violence leaves long shadows. It affects more than just those directly involved. It shapes communities. It influences trust in the justice system. It becomes part of local history. Even now, when people talk about the Cooper house or the Ryan family case, there is a mix of shock and disbelief. How could something so brutal happen in such a small place? How could questions still remain after so many years? Those are questions without simple answers. What is clear is that these stories continue to matter. They remind us that justice must be thorough, that evidence must be handled carefully, and that the lives lost in such tragedies should never be reduced to just headlines or rumors. For a small town, it truly was crazy stuff, and decades later, people are still trying to make sense of it. When I was growing up, my dad worked as a police officer. He was not the kind of officer who just handled traffic stops or routine paperwork. A large part of his job involved responding to the hardest calls, including suicides. Those were the scenes most people never see and never want to imagine. He rarely talked about his work in detail, especially when I was younger. But as I got older, he began sharing some of the experiences that had stayed with him over the years. One story, he told me, has never left my mind. It happened when he and his team were called to a railway incident. At first, it was reported simply as a person struck by a train. That kind of call already carries a heavy feeling. Trains do not stop quickly. The damage is usually severe. When officers respond, they already know they are walking into something tragic. According to my dad, the man had intentionally run in front of the train. It was not an accident. The train was moving at high speed, and there was no way for the operator to stop in time. What made the situation even more horrific was the way the impact happened. The front of a train has metal components and couplings that connect cars and stabilize movement. When the man was struck, his pelvis became caught on one of those metal structures. Instead of being thrown clear, his body was pinned and dragged forward as the train continued down the track. Trains can take a long distance to come to a full stop, especially at speed. In this case, the train traveled almost 1 kilometer before it was able to halt completely. During that time, the man's body was dragged along the tracks. When my dad described arriving at the scene, he said it was something he could never fully erase from his memory. The only parts of the man that remained mostly intact were his spine, head, and part of his upper chest. The rest of his body had been torn away during the dragging. The physical reality of what had happened was difficult enough, but what disturbed my dad the most was what they learned next. The man did not die instantly. After the train stopped, he was still alive for several minutes. Witnesses and the train operator reported signs of movement. Emergency responders confirmed that he had a pulse for a short period after the train came to a stop. It is believed that he survived for around 10 minutes. That detail haunted my dad more than the visual scene itself. The idea that the man may have been conscious, even briefly, after enduring that kind of trauma, was almost impossible to process. Whether he was fully aware or not is something no one can truly know. Severe shock often shuts down sensation and awareness quickly. The human body can enter a state where pain is not experienced in the normal way because the nervous system is overwhelmed. But still, the possibility that he felt anything during those final moments is what stayed with the officers. Once emergency medical personnel confirmed the man had died, the scene shifted from rescue to recovery. That part of the job is rarely talked about publicly, but it is one of the hardest responsibilities officers and first responders face. Because the body had been dragged for nearly a kilometer, remains were scattered along the tracks. It was not a matter of simply securing one location. About 14 officers had to spread out along that stretch of railway and manually search for body parts. They walked slowly, scanning gravel, metal rails, and the surrounding area. It took hours. My dad said there was very little conversation during that process. The work required focus and respect. Every piece found had to be carefully collected. documentation had to be thorough. Even in the face of something so violent, there is a deep commitment among officers to treat remains with dignity. Railway workers stood nearby, shaken. The train operator was devastated. People sometimes forget that when someone chooses to step in front of a train, it is not only their own life that changes. The operator has to live with that memory. So do the officers who respond. So do the cleanup crews. When my dad came home that night, he did not say much. He carried the weight quietly. That was something I later realized about many first responders. They often shield their families from the worst of what they see. But some cases stay with them so strongly that they need to talk about them eventually. He told me that suicide scenes are different from other kinds of calls. There is an added layer of sadness, anger sometimes, confusion. Officers often find themselves wondering what led the person to that point, what pain they were carrying, what might have prevented it. In this case, there were no dramatic clues left behind, no note explaining everything, just a tragic decision and its consequences. The physical horror of the event is hard to imagine, but what truly unsettled me when he told the story was not just the violence. It was the human element, the loneliness that must have existed in that man's mind before he ran toward that train, the ripple effect that followed, the train operator who likely replayed the moment over and over, the officers who spent hours searching the tracks, the family who eventually received the worst possible phone call. When my dad described the search along the kilometer of railway, he said it was one of the quietest shifts he had ever worked. 14 officers spread out in silence, each focused on a grim task. It was not something you can emotionally prepare for, yet it is part of the job. In the years since, conversations around mental health have become more open. In the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and many other countries, there has been growing awareness about suicide prevention, crisis hotlines, counseling services, and public campaigns aimed to reduce the stigma around seeking help. But stories like this remind us how urgent and real the issue is. For every statistic reported, there are responders who witness the aftermath. There are train operators who cannot stop in time. There are families left with unanswered questions. My dad told me that after that incident, the department offered counseling for the officers involved. Some accepted. Others tried to push through without it. Law enforcement culture has historically emphasized toughness, but slowly that has begun to change. Scenes like that leave marks, whether someone admits it or not. When he finished telling me the story, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said something simple that stuck with me. He said that no one truly understands how final a decision like that is until they see what it leaves behind. The image of officers walking along a stretch of railway, collecting what was once a living person, is not something I can forget. It is not told for shock value. It is a reminder of how devastating suicide can be, not just for the individual, but for everyone connected to the event. And if there is anything to take from a story like that, it is this. Pain that leads someone to that point is real, but help is real too. There are always other options, even when it does not feel that way. If anyone reading this ever feels overwhelmed or hopeless, reaching out to a crisis hotline or a trusted person can make a difference. In the U.S., dialing 988 connects to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. In the U.K. and Ireland, Samaritans can be reached at 116123. In Canada, Talk Suicide Canada is available at 1-833-456-4566. Support exists, even in the darkest moments. My dad carried many difficult scenes in his career, but That railway call was one he never forgot. And now, neither will I. When my mom was pregnant with my older sister, everything about the pregnancy had been fairly normal. She went to her regular checkups, followed the doctor's advice, and did all the things expectant mothers are told to do. This was before smartphones and social media, so information mostly came from doctors, books, and the evening news. She trusted the system, she trusted the hospital. It was just another routine afternoon when she went in for one of her appointments later in the pregnancy. She told me it was an ordinary visit. The waiting room was calm. Other pregnant women were sitting with magazines in their laps. Nurses called names one by one. Her blood pressure was checked. The baby's heartbeat was monitored. The doctor said everything looked good. No concerns, no warning signs. She left feeling reassured, thinking about baby clothes and nursery plans on the drive home. That evening was uneventful at first. She had dinner, relaxed a bit, and eventually turned on the television to watch the local news before bed. It was something she did most nights, just to catch up on what was happening around town. She expected to hear about traffic, maybe weather, maybe some small crime story. Instead, the news anchor's tone was serious in a way that immediately caught her attention. A breaking news story appeared on the screen. A pregnant woman had been kidnapped earlier that day. According to the report, another woman had lured her away under false pretenses. The details were still developing, but it quickly became clear that this was not a simple abduction. The victim had been taken to a nearby mountainous area. The suspect had attacked her and cut the baby out of her body using a key. My mom said her whole body went cold when she heard that. It was not just the brutality of the crime. It was the timing. The report mentioned that the kidnapping had happened shortly after the victim had left a doctor's appointment at the same hospital my mom had visited that very afternoon. The same hospital. The same type of appointment. The same stage of pregnancy. She sat there staring at the screen, trying to process what she was hearing. The idea that someone would target a pregnant woman in such a horrific way felt unreal. It felt like something from a crime show, not something happening in her own community. The news did not have all the answers yet. They did not know exactly how the suspect had identified the victim. They did not know whether she had been following her from the hospital or had arranged to meet her there. But the location detail alone was enough to shake my mom deeply. She started replaying her own day in her head. She thought about who had been sitting near her in the waiting room, who had walked out around the same time, who had parked nearby. She wondered if she had unknowingly crossed paths with the suspect. The thought made her feel sick. For the rest of the night, she could not sleep. Pregnancy already makes emotions stronger. Hormones heighten everything. But this was different. This was fear. A very specific, targeted kind of fear. It was not just about random crime. It was about someone seeking out pregnant women. Someone willing to commit unimaginable violence to get a baby. Over the next few days, more information came out. The suspect was reportedly a woman who had pretended to be pregnant herself. She had deceived people around her, telling them she was expecting. Investigators believed she had targeted the victim deliberately. The baby did not survive. The mother died from her injuries. The community was in shock. For my mom, the hospital no longer felt like just a place for checkups. It felt vulnerable. She began asking my dad to accompany her to every appointment after that. She avoided going anywhere alone for the remainder of her pregnancy. Even simple errands felt different. Before that night, she had never considered that being visibly pregnant could make someone a target. It is usually a time when strangers smile at you, hold doors open, and ask about due dates. It is supposed to be a period of anticipation and care. That story flipped something in her mind. She said the hardest part was realizing how ordinary the day had been. She had walked in and out of that hospital feeling safe. The other woman likely had too. There was no dramatic moment, no obvious warning. Just two women going about their day, one of whom never made it home safely. In hindsight, people always ask how something like that could happen. Were there warning signs? Was the suspect acting strangely? Could hospital staff have noticed something? But real life rarely presents itself in obvious red flags. People blend in. They smile. They speak politely. And sometimes the danger is hidden behind a completely normal face. For my mom, the randomness of it all was what haunted her. It was not that she believed she had almost been kidnapped herself. It was the realization that it could have been anyone, that the woman on the news might have been sitting just a few chairs away from her in that waiting room. She carried that fear quietly for the rest of the pregnancy. She tried not to let it overshadow the joy of preparing for her first child. She decorated the nursery. She folded tiny clothes. She attended childbirth classes. But in the back of her mind, there was a new awareness. Years later, when she told me the story, she described how that one news report changed how she viewed safety. It made her more cautious, more observant. It made her realize that even in familiar places, terrible things can happen without warning. For people in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries, stories like that feel especially disturbing because they attack something we see as deeply vulnerable and sacred. Pregnancy is associated with protection, not threat. When someone exploits that vulnerability, it shakes the sense of order we depend on. My mom said that after my sister was born, she felt a different kind of relief. Not just the normal relief of a healthy delivery, but relief that she had made it through the months of uncertainty safely. She never forgot the woman from the news. Even though she did not know her name personally, she felt connected to her in a strange way because of that shared afternoon at the hospital. It is easy to dismiss stories like this as rare, extreme cases. And statistically, they are rare. But rarity does not erase the impact for those who hear them at the right moment. Especially during a vulnerable time in life, they leave a lasting mark. My mom still remembers exactly where she was sitting when that news report aired. She remembers the tone of the anchor's voice. She remembers the shock in her chest. And she remembers looking down at her own pregnant belly, suddenly aware of how fragile everything felt. That is the part that stays with me when she tells it. Not just the crime itself, but the way an ordinary day can turn into something you replay in your mind for years. She went to a routine doctor's appointment. Everything was fine. She came home thinking about baby names and nursery paint colors. And that night, she learned how close normal life can sit next to unimaginable horror. It is a reminder that safety is often something we take for granted until something shakes it. And sometimes, just hearing about what happened to someone else is enough to change how you move through the world from that day forward. When I was 17, I thought I understood people pretty well. I had my group of friends, school felt predictable, and life in our town seemed steady. Nothing about it suggested danger or hidden secrets. That is probably why what happened later still feels unreal when I look back on it. At that time, I had a crush on a girl I had known for a while. We were close friends first. Over time, that friendship shifted into something more complicated. It was not exactly a full relationship, but it was more than casual. We spent a lot of time together. We talked late into the night. We shared things with each other that we did not tell other people. When you are that age, closeness can feel intense and permanent, even if it does not last. She trusted me, or at least it felt that way. She would open up about her past in ways that surprised me. Some of her stories were strange, almost unbelievable. She talked about her childhood like it had been chaotic and unstable. She described her parents constantly moving from place to place. She said they had survived through small scams and shoplifting. She hinted at crimes that had been committed or covered up. There were moments when she would say something dramatic, then brush it off like it was normal. I never took those stories too seriously. The reason was simple. Her family did not look like criminals. They looked like the opposite. Her mother owned a cozy coffee shop in town. It was the kind of place people loved to visit. The decor was warm, the pastries were fresh, and her mom always smiled at customers. Her father worked as a manager at a local paper processing plant. It was a stable, respectable job. Her brothers ran their own business. The family lived comfortably. Their house was nice. Their lifestyle matched what you would expect from hardworking people. Nothing about them raised red flags. When I visited her home, everything seemed normal. Her dad would greet me warmly. He treated me almost like part of the family. He asked about school and my plans for the future. There was no tension, no obvious sign that anything was wrong. If someone had asked me then, I would have said they were a solid, successful family. Because of that, I assumed the stories she told me were exaggerated or maybe misremembered from childhood. Sometimes kids grow up and interpret things dramatically. Maybe her parents had struggled financially at one point. Maybe they had moved often. It did not seem impossible. But serious crimes? Mafia connections? It sounded like something out of a movie. At 17, I was more focused on her than on analyzing her family's history. We were caught up in our own world. I did not push for details. I did not investigate. I just listened. Eventually, like many teenage relationships, ours faded. We stopped talking as much. The physical part ended. We drifted back into being just friends. It was not dramatic. It was just life moving on. But something changed after that. Her father's behavior toward me shifted. Before, he had been friendly and relaxed. After our relationship ended, he became colder, watchful. There was one incident that I will never forget. One evening, I went over to her house to hang out, like I had done many times before. Apparently, her father did not know I would be there. When he walked in and saw me, he reacted instantly. He pulled a gun on me. It happened fast. 1 second, we were in the living room talking. The next, he was standing there with a weapon pointed in my direction. My heart stopped. For a moment, I could not even process what was happening. He did not fire. After a tense few seconds, there was confusion, raised voices, and an explanation that he had not been told I was visiting. Eventually, he lowered the gun. But something about that moment stayed with me. Even after everything calmed down, I could not shake the feeling that his reaction had been extreme. I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he was overly protective. Maybe he had a short temper. People in rural or industrial towns sometimes own firearms. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than bad communication. About 2 years later, I learned how wrong I had been. Through conversations and local news, I discovered that her father had been arrested, not for something minor, not for a simple mistake. He had been charged with serious crimes, including murder, robbery, and weapons smuggling. He had connections to a local mafia network. The arrest came after authorities linked him to the invasion and robbery of a storage facility owned by a chain of department stores. When I first heard it, I thought it had to be a rumor. The man I had sat across from at dinner, the man who had asked about my grades, could not be the same person described in those charges. But it was true. As more details surfaced, pieces of her old stories began to feel different. The constant moving, the small scams, the hints about crimes. Maybe they were not exaggerations after all. And maybe she had been telling the truth in her own way. And I had simply chosen not to believe it because it did not fit the image I saw. The most chilling part came later. I found out that before I had fully cut ties with the family, her father had considered harming me. According to what I was told, he believed I knew too much about his life. Because of the stories she had shared with me, even if I barely remembered them, he saw me as a potential threat. When I heard that, I felt a wave of cold realization. The gun incident suddenly took on a different meaning. It was not just surprise or miscommunication. There may have been something deeper behind his reaction. The idea that someone had thought about killing me, even briefly, is something I still struggle to fully absorb. At 17, and I had no sense of how close I might have been to real danger, I was just a teenager with a crush, hanging out at my girlfriend's house. Thankfully, he was arrested before anything like that could happen. He is still in prison. But the damage to his family was severe. My friend's life changed overnight. The business reputation, the community image, the stability they once had, all of it collapsed under the weight of the charges. Even if she had known pieces of the truth growing up, seeing it exposed publicly must have been devastating. I sometimes think about how easy it is for people to hide parts of their lives. You can present one face to the world and keep another hidden. You can run a coffee shop, manage a plant, smile at neighbors, and still carry secrets no one suspects. When I look back at 17-year-old me, I see someone naive. Not foolish, just young. I believed what I saw. I assumed that outward success and kindness meant safety. I did not imagine that serious crime could exist behind such a normal exterior. The experience changed how I view people. Not in a paranoid way, but in a more aware way. I learned that reality can be layered, that someone can be friendly and dangerous at the same time, that stories you dismiss as exaggerations might contain truth. I also feel a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude that nothing worse happened to me. Sadness for my friend who grew up in a family built on secrets and lies. No matter what her father did, she still has to live with the fallout. It is easy to hear a story like this and think it belongs in a crime documentary. But for me, it was just part of growing up. It was part of learning that the world is more complicated than it appears at first glance. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had remembered more of the stories she told me. If I had asked questions, if I had stayed longer. Those thoughts do not lead anywhere useful, but they pass through my mind from time to time. What I know for certain is this. The version of someone you see on the surface is not always the whole story. And sometimes you only understand that years later, when the truth finally comes out. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When I was in high school, there was a morning I still remember clearly. It started like any other school day. The hallway was loud, lockers slamming, people half awake and rushing to class. But one of my close friends walked in, looking completely different from her usual self. She wasn't just tired. She looked shaken, pale. Her hands were trembling when she set her backpack down. At first, we thought maybe she had fought with her parents or failed a test. That's the kind of drama that usually fills a teenager's world. But this was different. She kept glancing around like she didn't want anyone else to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and unsteady. She told us that the police had come to her street the night before. They had done a welfare check on her next-door neighbor after no one had seen the woman for 3 days. The neighbor was someone my friend saw regularly. She lived alone. She would wave from the driveway, sometimes chat over the fence. Then suddenly, nothing. No car moving, no lights on at night, no sign of her at all. Someone had finally called it in. Maybe another neighbor, maybe a coworker. The police showed up to check on her. That part at first sounded routine. Welfare checks happen when someone goes quiet for too long. Most of the time, it turns out to be nothing serious. But this time it wasn't. According to what my friend had heard from her parents and from the police presence on the street, 2 men had broken into the house days earlier. They had kept her inside, repeatedly drugging her so she couldn't resist or escape. They assaulted her over and over again for 3 days. 3 full days of isolation and terror in her own home. As my friend described it, her words came out rushed, almost tangled. She was trying to process what she'd been told while telling it to us at the same time. She said the police found the woman tied up and still heavily drugged when they finally got inside. It sounded like whenever officers had first knocked or done earlier checks, the men had kept her restrained and sedated, so no one would hear or see anything suspicious. Whether that detail was completely accurate or partly rumor, I don't know. In high school, information spreads fast, and sometimes pieces get distorted. But the core of it was true. Something terrible had happened right next door to someone we knew. At 17, your sense of safety still feels mostly intact. You worry about grades, relationships, and what college you might get into. You don't fully grasp how vulnerable people can be in their own homes. Hearing that story cracked something in me. The idea that someone could be trapped like that, in a quiet neighborhood, while the world just kept moving outside, was overwhelming. I remember sitting there in the cafeteria, barely touching my food, trying to imagine what those 3 days must have felt like for that woman. The fear, the confusion from being drugged, the helplessness. Your home is supposed to be the safest place you have. It's where you lock the doors and let your guard down. To have that space invaded in such a violent way is almost impossible to fully understand. My friend was shaken for days afterward. Police cars had lined her street. Crime scene tape had gone up. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in small groups. Her parents pulled their kids inside earlier than usual that week. Porch lights stayed on longer at night. It felt like the whole neighborhood had shifted. One thing that stuck with me was how close it all was. This wasn't something happening in a faraway city or on the evening news. It was the house next door to someone I saw every day at school. It made the world feel smaller and more unpredictable. I don't know if the men were ever caught. My friend wasn't sure either. She had heard bits and pieces from her parents, but after the initial shock, the details faded from conversation. Life, especially in high school, has a way of moving forward quickly. Exams came up. Sports games happened. Graduation approached. But every now and then I would think about that neighbor. I wondered how she was doing. How do you recover from something like that? Physically, there are wounds that can heal, but emotionally, the impact can linger for years. Survivors of prolonged assault often struggle with anxiety, trust issues, sleep disturbances, and trauma that resurfaces unexpectedly. Even simple things like hearing footsteps outside a window can trigger fear. What haunted me most was the idea of time. 3 days is long. Think about what 3 days means in ordinary life. It's a weekend. It's 72 hours. It's enough time to binge watch a show or take a short trip. For her, it was 72 hours of being trapped and harmed in her own house. As a teenager, I didn't have the language to process that kind of violence. It felt like something from a crime show, except it was real. We whispered about it between classes. Some students exaggerated details. Others avoided talking about it at all. There was a heavy feeling whenever it came up. It also changed the way I thought about safety. I started double-checking locks at home. I paid more attention to strange cars parked on my street. I noticed how easily we assumed that if something were wrong, we would know. But sometimes terrible things happen quietly behind closed doors. Looking back now as an adult, I think about how much strength that woman must have had just to survive those 3 days. Survival itself can be an act of resilience. When someone endures something that traumatic and still manages to be found alive, that matters. It means she had a chance to heal, even if healing would be a long road. I also think about how important that welfare check was. Someone noticed her absence. Someone cared enough to call the police. That simple act might have saved her life. It reminds me that community awareness isn't just a concept. It can make a real difference. If no one had spoken up, who knows how much longer it would have gone on. For audiences in places like the United States, the United Kingdom, or Canada, stories like this feel both distant and uncomfortably possible. Break-ins and assaults are not daily realities for most people, but they happen often enough to remind us that safety is not guaranteed. It underscores the importance of looking out for neighbors and taking unusual absences seriously. Over the years, the memory of that morning at school has stayed with me. Not because of gossip or drama, but because of the emotional weight of it. Seeing my friend so shaken made it real. Her fear was visible. It wasn't just a headline. It was someone she knew, someone whose house she could see from her own bedroom window. Sometimes I wonder what became of that neighbor. Did she move away? Did she stay and try to reclaim her space? Did she find support and counseling? I hope she did. I hope she was surrounded by people who believed her, who helped her rebuild some sense of safety. There's something about being 17 and hearing about that kind of violence that changes you slightly. It pulls you out of that bubble of teenage invincibility. It forces you to understand that the world can be harsh in ways you weren't prepared for. At the same time, it also highlighted how communities can respond. Neighbors checked on each other more often after that. Parents talked to their kids about safety. My friend's family installed additional locks and cameras. It didn't erase what happened, but it showed that people were paying attention. Even now, years later, when I drive past quiet suburban streets with tidy lawns and quiet driveways, I think about how much can happen behind those doors that the outside world doesn't see. Appearances can be deceiving. Normal neighborhoods can hold hidden stories. What stays with me most is the unanswered question of how she's doing now. Is she okay? Did she manage to build a life beyond that trauma? I hope she did. I hope the worst thing that ever happened to her did not define the rest of her years. That day in high school taught me something I didn't fully understand at the time. It taught me that being aware matters. that checking on people matters, that silence on a street can mean something. And it taught me that even when we're young and not ready to carry heavy stories, sometimes they find us anyway. I still remember my friend's expression that morning. The shock, the disbelief, the fear that something so violent could happen so close to home. It's a reminder that safety is precious and fragile, and that empathy for others, especially those who endure trauma, is something we should never take lightly. One night when I was younger, I was driving through the mountains with my ex-boyfriend. It was winter, the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp in your lungs. The road we were on wasn't a main highway. It was one of those narrow, winding mountain roads that barely show up on maps. No streetlights, no nearby houses. Just long stretches of dark forest and snow piled along the edges of the pavement. It must have been close to midnight. The sky was completely black, and the only light came from our headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees looked skeletal, their branches bare and frosted over. It was the kind of setting that already feels slightly unreal, like you've stepped into a scene from a thriller movie. We were talking casually, nothing serious, when suddenly my ex slowed the car down. At first, I didn't understand why. Then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road, a woman, maybe around 50 years old. She was dressed entirely in white. Not winter clothes, not a coat or boots, just what looked like a thin, old-fashioned nightgown or sleeping dress. The fabric was loose and pale, the kind of style you might imagine from the 1950s. Her long brown hair hung down around her shoulders, unmoving in the cold air. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't walking. She was just standing there, perfectly still. The first thing that struck me was how wrong it felt. It was the middle of winter. The temperature had to be near freezing, maybe even below. There were no houses nearby. I remember thinking that the closest home had to be at least a kilometer away, maybe more. The area was completely rural. No cabins, no lights in the distance. Just snow and trees. My mind immediately tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe her car had broken down. Maybe she had gotten lost. But there was no car in sight. No headlights behind her. No hazard lights blinking. Nothing. As we got closer, I could see her face more clearly. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look distressed. If anything, she looked blank, almost expressionless. Her eyes seemed unfocused, like she wasn't really seeing us at all. My ex whispered, "What is she doing out here?" I didn't have an answer. For a split second, we both considered stopping. It felt wrong to drive past someone, standing alone in freezing weather wearing almost nothing. But something about the situation made us hesitate. The isolation, the stillness, the fact that she wasn't signaling for help. We slowed down enough that our headlights fully illuminated her. The white fabric of her dress almost glowed against the dark forest. She didn't move. She didn't shield her eyes from the brightness. She didn't step back. She just stood there, at the edge of the road, like she was waiting for something. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. My ex made a decision quickly. He didn't stop. He pressed the gas gently and drove past her. As we did, I turned in my seat to look back through the rear window. She was still there, standing in the same spot, completely still. The further we drove, the more the reality of it sank in. My heart was racing. The road ahead felt even darker than before. Every curve made me tense. I kept replaying the image in my mind. The white dress, the bare arms, the snow on the ground, the total silence. About 5 minutes later, we both started talking at once, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe she lives nearby, but there weren't any houses. Maybe she's sleepwalking. In that cold? We debated turning around, calling someone, doing something. But we were young and fear had already settled in. There's a specific kind of fear that comes from situations that don't make sense. It's not just about danger. It's about the unknown. What if it was some kind of trap? That thought crossed my mind, even though it sounded paranoid. You hear stories about people staging roadside emergencies to lure drivers out of their cars. We didn't know what to think. Eventually, we reached a slightly more populated area and felt the tension ease a little. But neither of us forgot it. For days afterward, I kept thinking about her. Was she okay? Did someone else stop? Did she walk back into the forest after we passed? There's also the possibility that she was in some kind of mental health crisis. Hypothermia can make people act strangely. Severe stress or psychological conditions can lead someone to wander. It's possible she had left her home in confusion. That explanation feels the most grounded, even if it's still unsettling. But what makes the memory stick is the atmosphere of that moment. The emptiness of the mountain road. The deep winter silence. The unnatural stillness of her body. It felt like time paused for a few seconds as we passed her. Years later, I still see it clearly when I think about it. The way the headlights framed her in white. The way the snow reflected faint light around her feet. The way the dark forest seemed to swallow everything beyond a few meters. I don't think it was something supernatural. I try not to jump to that conclusion. But it felt eerie in a way that's hard to explain. There was something about the setting and the timing that made it feel almost staged, like a scene placed deliberately in our path. If I were in that situation now, older and maybe braver, I might handle it differently. I might call emergency services immediately and report someone standing in dangerous conditions. At the time, we were just two young people on a dark road, unsure and afraid. The memory hasn't faded. It hasn't become less strange. If anything, it's become more haunting because there was no resolution, no news story, no explanation, just that image frozen in my mind. A woman in white, in the middle of winter, on an empty mountain road, standing completely still. I grew up on the eastern coast of India, in a city that was busy but calm in its own way. Life there moved at a steady pace. I had a simple upbringing, loving parents, and the kind of childhood where nothing truly frightening ever seemed possible. The sea was never too far away. The markets were always alive with sound, and even the evenings felt warm and familiar. I never thought I would one day look back at those peaceful years and feel grateful for how ordinary everything used to be. After finishing high school, I enrolled in a local college for my bachelor's degree. That was where I met her. She was in one of my classes, and we realized quickly that we shared similar interests. We both loved horror movies, old legends, road trips with no fixed plans, and long conversations about strange topics most people avoided. We would often skip the crowded hangout spots and instead drive around the city outskirts, exploring new neighborhoods, half-built roads, and quiet beaches. We talked about everything: movies, history, random conspiracy theories, and sometimes our fears. By the time this incident happened, we had known each other for over a year. We were close. Not just friends who met for coffee, but the kind who shared secrets and late-night calls. That evening started like any other. We had decided to go to the movies and then look at an apartment we were considering renting together. The idea of moving out felt exciting. It was a new chapter in life. we chose to watch Annabelle. Horror movies were our thing, even though I scared easily, and she loved teasing me about it. We bought tickets for the next show and had some time before it started. While standing outside the theater, we noticed something strange. It began to drizzle. Now, that might not sound unusual to someone from the US or UK, but where I lived, December rain was extremely rare. That part of India does not usually get winter rain. It was mid-December, and the air was normally dry and cool. But that evening, thin streams of rain began falling, almost gently at first. People around us looked confused. Some even checked the sky as if expecting an explanation. We brushed it off and laughed about how dramatic it felt, like something straight out of a horror movie. We grabbed popcorn and drinks and went inside. The movie was exactly what you would expect. Sudden, loud sounds, dark scenes, creepy dolls, and jump scares that made the entire theater gasp. She clutched my arm at some parts, Mata even though she pretended to be fearless. By the end, we were both slightly shaken, but pretending we weren't. When we walked out of the theater, the rain had grown heavier. The parking lot lights reflected off the wet pavement, making everything look darker and more distorted than usual. That was when I noticed him. A man stood a few blocks away from my car. He was dressed entirely in black. Not just a jacket, black pants, black shoes, maybe even a dark hood. He was completely drenched in rain, yet he stood still, almost too still. It felt like he was waiting for something. Or someone. For a second, I felt like he was watching us. Then, as soon as we started walking toward the car, he turned and walked away quickly. He did not look back once. I could not see his face clearly. The rain and distance made it impossible. But I noticed he was well-built, tall, and moved with purpose. It could have meant nothing. Maybe he was just another moviegoer. But after watching a horror film, your mind plays tricks on you. Every shadow feels alive. We got into the car quickly and locked the doors. I remember forcing a laugh, saying something like, "See? Real-life horror bonus." She smiled, but I could tell she had noticed him too. Instead of heading straight home, we decided to check out the apartment we had been discussing. It was located on the opposite side of the city, in a quieter, less developed area where rent was cheaper. The drive took about 30 minutes. The property was inside a relatively new building, but the surroundings were underdeveloped. Few streetlights, wide, empty plots of land, and long, silent stretches of road. When we stepped inside the apartment, we could not help but laugh. The layout strangely resembled the house in the movie we had just seen. Long hallway, slight echo, empty rooms. We joked about ghosts coming with the rent. It was nearly sunset by the time we left. The sky had turned a deep orange, fading into gray. We got into the car, and that was when the GPS started malfunctioning. It kept losing signal. I assumed it was because the area had weak network coverage, so I decided to rely on memory. She reminded me she had a curfew and suggested we take the shorter route back. The shorter route, however, passed through a deserted stretch of road. I hesitated, but agreed. The road was dimly lit. Street lamps were placed far apart, and many areas were completely dark between them. There were no shops, no houses close by, no pedestrians, just long asphalt, cutting through open land. To distract ourselves, she began telling me a story. It was about Bhangar Fort in Rajasthan, a place famous for paranormal legends. According to local belief, it is one of the most haunted places in India. She said her friend had visited it once. While inside the fort, her friend felt an intense cold, even though the weather outside was warm. The guide had told them the story of a battle centuries ago, when the fort was attacked and the king's army was brutally killed. The queen supposedly asked a priest to bind the souls of her fallen soldiers to the fort. The idea was that even if enemies captured it, the restless spirits would never allow them peace. Her friend had claimed to see ancient wall carvings that seemed to depict this very story. As she spoke, the road grew darker. I laughed nervously and told her to stop. She grinned mischievously and said, "What if I shout Banga right now and something actually happens?" Before I could tell her not to, she said the word, and instantly the street lamps went out, not one by one, all at once. At the same moment, my car headlights shut off. Everything became pitch black. I felt my chest tighten. The darkness was absolute. I could not see my own hands on the steering wheel. There were no other cars in sight. We sat frozen. I tried switching the headlights on again. Nothing. I checked the battery indicator. It seemed fine, but the lights would not respond. After about 10 minutes of sitting in darkness, I noticed faint red taillights in the rearview mirror. A car was approaching from behind. Relief washed over me. I turned on the hazard lights, thankfully those worked, and stepped out of the car with my phone flashlight. The car stopped behind us. A man stepped out. As he approached, I felt my stomach drop. Even in the dim light, I recognized the outline, the build, the height. It was the same man from the theater parking lot. My heart started pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I flashed my light toward him and blurted out, "I saw you at the theater earlier. I know you." He paused. The glare from his car headlights made it hard to see his face clearly. It felt like the light was intentionally blocking my view. He spoke calmly. "I mean you no harm. I understand you are cautious. I will stay back." His voice was steady, not threatening, not aggressive. I glanced inside my car. She looked pale, not just scared, but frozen in terror. I had never seen her look like that before. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. I leaned toward her window and whispered, "It's okay. He's helping us." She tried to speak, but no words came out. The man examined the engine from a distance and instructed me to press a red switch near the battery area. He explained it would help reset the connection. I did exactly what he said. Suddenly, the headlights flickered back on. The street lamps came back to life at the same time. Relief flooded through me. I turned to thank him. But he was already walking back to his car. "Thank you," I shouted. He did not respond. I got back into my car, smiling nervously. "See? Everything's fine." She grabbed my arm tightly and looked straight into my eyes. "Who were you talking to?" "To the man behind us," I said. "There is no one behind us," she whispered. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I did not see anyone. You stepped out and started talking to yourself. Then you opened the hood and fixed it." I felt something cold move through me. I turned around to point at the car behind us. There was nothing there, no headlights, no engine sound, no tire marks. The road was empty. Without saying another word, I started driving. The rest of the drive was silent, completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy. After dropping her home, she held my arm again and said, "Call me when you reach." Her voice trembled. It has been 3 years since that night. We both still talk about it sometimes. We both remember the man. We both remember the darkness. But only one of us remembers speaking to him. And to this day, I cannot explain who or what helped me fix that car on that empty road.ac. I have always had a strange habit of reading about true crime for hours at a time. Sometimes I tell myself I will only read one article, but then I fall into a rabbit hole of documentaries, interviews, and case summaries. Some stories stay with you longer than others. One of the ones that always stuck in my mind was a case from Australia, known as the Snowtown murders. I first heard about it years ago, but I did not remember all the details clearly. What I remembered most vividly was the image of bodies being hidden inside large barrels. From what I recall, chemicals were used to help the bodies decompose, although I cannot say for certain if I am remembering that part correctly. The barrels were stored inside what had once been a bank vault. That detail always made it feel even more disturbing to me. A bank vault is supposed to protect valuables. In this case, it was hiding something horrific. Before the bodies were discovered in Snowtown, there had been other murders connected to the same group, but at the time, they were not linked together. Some victims were reported missing. Others were assumed to have left town. It was not immediately clear that there was a pattern. That is often what makes cases like this so unsettling. For a while, life seems normal on the surface. People go to work. They see their neighbors. No one realizes what is happening behind closed doors. The Snowtown case later became known as one of the most shocking crime stories in Australian history. The idea that multiple victims were hidden in barrels inside a quiet rural town made it feel almost unreal. It sounded like something from a movie rather than real life. When I first read about it, I felt that mix of fascination and disbelief that true crime often brings. How could something so extreme happen without being noticed sooner? Years passed, and I did not think about it much. Then, more than 5 years ago, I was at home watching the Crime Channel on Foxtel. They were airing an episode about the Snowtown murders. I remember sitting there casually, half paying attention while the documentary went over the timeline of events. It showed the small town. It talked about the discovery of the barrels. It interviewed people who had lived in the area at the time. As the program continued, my mom walked into the room and glanced at the screen. She listened for a moment and then said something that caught me completely off guard. She told me that one of the victims was the mother of a man she used to be close friends with. She said his name was Troy. Apparently, when she was younger, she had known him quite well. She described him as someone who did amazing artwork and had a real talent for creativity. I remember looking at her, unsure whether to believe what she was saying. My mom has a habit of exaggerating stories or adding dramatic details. It is something our family jokes about sometimes. She can take a simple event and make it sound much bigger than it really was. So when she casually mentioned that one of the victims was Troy's mom, I did not know how seriously to take it. Part of me wanted to ask more questions. Which victim? How did she know for sure? Did she stay in touch with Troy after everything happened? But the moment passed quickly. The documentary moved on to another segment and the conversation shifted. Still, that comment stayed in my mind. If what she said was true, it would mean that someone connected, even indirectly to our family, had been affected by one of the worst crime cases in Australian history. That realization made the story feel closer, more personal. It was no longer just something I had read about online or watched on television. It would mean that behind one of the names on that list of victims was a person who had once been part of my mom's life. At the same time, I could not ignore the possibility that she might have been exaggerating. Without checking records or asking more direct questions, there was no way to confirm it. Over the years, I have learned to take some of her dramatic statements with caution. She enjoys telling stories. Sometimes they grow a little in the telling. Even with that uncertainty, the thought stuck with me. True crime often feels distant until you realize how small the world can be. You start to understand that behind every headline there are real families, real friends, and real communities. Cases like Snowtown are not just statistics. They ripple outward and touch lives in ways that are not always visible to outsiders. Another story from my family that has always stayed with me is something I heard about my grandparents. When my Nan and Pop were younger, they did a lot of traveling. From what I was told, they were involved in church mission work in different parts of the world. One place that came up in family conversations was Papua New Guinea. According to what I remember being told, my pop once witnessed someone being beheaded there. It was not something that was ever discussed openly or in detail. It was more like a quiet fact that everyone seemed to know, but did not talk about much. The way it was described made it sound like it was connected to local conflict or violence at the time. I do not know the exact circumstances. I was young when I first heard about it. The idea that someone in my own family had seen something so brutal felt hard to process. It is one thing to read about violence in a book or see it in a documentary. It is another to imagine your grandfather standing there and witnessing it in real life. I never asked him directly about it. It did not feel like something you just bring up casually at the dinner table. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how experiences like that shape a person. If he really did witness such an event, it must have stayed with him. Some things cannot simply be forgotten. Even if they are never spoken about, they can leave a quiet mark on someone's life. When I think about these stories together, the Snowtown case, my mom's possible connection to a victim's family, and my pop's experience overseas, I notice a pattern. They all exist somewhere between certainty and uncertainty. Some details are clear, others are blurry. Memory is not perfect. Family stories shift over time. There is also something strange about how crime stories intersect with everyday life. You can grow up feeling like terrible events happen somewhere far away in places disconnected from your world. Then you find out that someone your mom knew was tied to a major case, or that your grandfather witnessed something violent during his travels. Suddenly, those events do not feel so distant. I cannot say for sure whether my mom's claim about Troy is accurate. I cannot say for sure what exactly my pop witnessed in Papua New Guinea. What I can say is that these fragments of stories have stayed with me. They remind me that the world is complicated and sometimes darker than we realize. When you read about cases like Snowtown, it is easy to focus on the shocking details, the barrels, the vault, the headlines. But behind all of that are human lives, families who lost someone, friends who were left trying to understand what happened. And when those stories brush up against your own life, even indirectly, they feel different. They feel heavier. They become less about curiosity and more about reflection. Maybe one day I will look into the details more carefully and see whether my mom's story lines up with the facts. Maybe I will sit down and ask more questions about my grandparents' travels. Or maybe these stories will remain half-remembered pieces of family history. For now, they exist in that in-between space, part memory, part mystery, part reminder that the world holds stories far stranger and more tragic than we often imagine. Before everything happened, I was not religious at all. I would have described myself as an atheist without hesitation. I did not believe in demons, spirits, or ancient deities. If someone had told me they were being haunted, I would have assumed stress, imagination, or maybe untreated mental health issues. I believed in what I could see, measure, and explain. That was my mindset for most of my life. Then my family and I moved into a house that completely changed how I saw the world. At first, the house seemed normal. It was an older place, but nothing unusual for the neighborhood. It had that typical, slightly worn feeling that many older homes have. The floors creaked a bit. The walls had small imperfections. The backyard was narrow with an alley running behind it. The neighbors were friendly. There was no dramatic backstory given to us when we bought it. No warnings. No strange rumors. The first week, there was uneventful. We unpacked, arranged furniture, and settled into what we hoped would be a fresh start. I remember feeling proud that we had found something affordable and in a decent area. There was nothing about the house that felt threatening. The changes began slowly. At first, it was small things that were easy to ignore. Doors would open slightly on their own, which I blamed on airflow. I would hear light tapping noises in the walls, which I assumed were pipes or normal house sounds. We all brushed it off. When you move into a new place, every unfamiliar sound feels amplified. Then it started escalating. One afternoon, I was in the living room when I felt an overwhelming sense of pressure. It is hard to describe properly. It was not physical pain. It was more like the air itself had become heavy. My chest felt tight, and I had the strange sensation that I was being watched. Not in a paranoid way, but in a way that felt deeply intrusive. That night, I had my first dream about the figure. In the dream, I was standing in what looked like our backyard, but everything was darker and distorted. Towering over me was something massive. It had the head of a bull, or maybe a ram or something between the two. Its horns curved outward. Its eyes were not glowing like in movies. They were calm and focused, which made it worse somehow. It stood impossibly tall, at least 11 feet high. I remember feeling small and powerless in its presence. When I woke up, I dismissed it as just a nightmare. I had been stressed from the move. Dreams can be vivid when your mind is adjusting to change. But then other things started happening that were harder to dismiss. There were moments during the day, in full daylight, when I would feel sudden force against my body. One afternoon, while stepping outside to grab the mail, I felt like something shoved me from behind. It was not a light push. I stumbled forward and fell hard onto the sidewalk. My neighbors saw me fall. They rushed over, asking if I had tripped. I could not explain it. There was nothing behind me. No crack in the pavement. No object I had hit. The most disturbing event happened in broad daylight. I was crossing the street near our house when I felt that same overwhelming pressure. Before I could react, it felt like I was lifted or thrown. I landed several feet away, scraping my hands and knees. The impact knocked the breath out of me. People nearby saw me fall, but from their perspective, it looked like I had lost my balance. No one saw anything push me. No one saw anything unusual at all. Inside the house, the atmosphere became heavier with each passing day. My family began experiencing things too. My partner reported hearing whispering at night. My child woke up crying, saying something tall was standing in the hallway. We tried not to talk about it too much because saying it out loud made it feel more real. Then came the insects. One evening, I stepped into the backyard and saw something that still does not make sense to me. Large insects, resembling locusts, were scattered across the ground. They were not small. Some were nearly the size of my shoe. I live in a place where you do not expect swarms like that. They seemed to appear suddenly, covering the yard and the alley behind the house. By the next morning, they were gone. Completely gone. No bodies. No signs they had been there. There were nights when it seemed like droplets of something dark would fall in the alley behind the house. It looked like blood in the dim light. It would only last briefly. By morning, there was no trace of it. I know how that sounds. If someone else told me this story years ago, I would have rolled my eyes. Throughout all of this, I never felt like whatever was happening wanted to kill me. That might sound strange, but it felt more like oppression than attack. It felt like something was trying to wear me down, to frighten me, to weaken me. The dreams became more frequent. The towering figure would stand at the edge of my vision. Sometimes it would not move at all. It would just be there. At one point, I became obsessed with researching ancient mythologies. I was trying to find an image that matched what I kept seeing in my dreams. I came across references to various ancient deities and demon-like figures with animal heads. One name that appeared during my research was Balaam, described in some texts as a being with multiple animal aspects. I do not know whether my mind made the connection after reading, or whether the name stuck because it gave shape to what I was experiencing. What I know is that I was no longer the confident atheist I once was. I was frightened, not in a dramatic movie way, but in a deep, constant way that followed me everywhere. My sleep was broken. My appetite changed. My patience with my family grew thin because I was constantly on edge. After about a month of this, I agreed to something I never thought I would consider. We contacted someone who performed religious rituals, hoping that it would cleanse the house. I did not fully believe in what he was doing, but I was desperate. When you feel like your reality is shifting, you will try almost anything to regain control. The ritual took place inside the house. Prayers were spoken, holy water was sprinkled, there was chanting. For a short time afterward, the atmosphere felt lighter. I allowed myself to hope that it was over. But within days, the pressure returned. The dreams resumed. The strange events continued. It felt like whatever was there was not impressed. At that point, my thinking had become less rational. Fear changes the way you make decisions. Someone suggested contacting a different kind of practitioner, someone who worked outside traditional religious frameworks. I never imagined I would agree to that, but I did. She described herself as a witch, though not in the dramatic sense people imagine. She spoke calmly. She did not mock me. She listened carefully to everything I described. She suggested protective rituals and symbolic actions to reclaim the space. After her visit, things gradually began to settle. There was no dramatic moment where a figure vanished or a voice screamed. It was quieter than that. The house slowly began to feel normal again. The dreams stopped. The oppressive feeling lifted. Looking back now, I struggle to fully understand what happened. Part of me wonders whether stress, sleep deprivation, and anxiety created a cascade of experiences that felt supernatural. The human mind is powerful. It can create vivid perceptions under pressure. Another part of me cannot ignore how real it all felt at the time. The physical sensations, the shared experiences within my family, the timing of everything. What I know for certain is that I am not the same person I was before we moved into that house. I no longer dismiss other people's fears so easily. I have learned that whether something is supernatural or psychological, the fear it creates is real. We eventually moved out. I needed distance from that place. I needed to rebuild my sense of stability. Over time, life returned to normal. I sleep better now. The heavy feeling has not followed us. If you had asked me years ago whether I believed in demons, I would have laughed. Now, I do not claim to understand everything. I'm not here to convince anyone. I only know what I experienced. And whatever it was, it felt like something that did not want to destroy me quickly. It wanted to linger, to oppress, to take up space in my life. That is what unsettles me the most. When I was 4 years old, my family and I were living in California. I do not remember every detail clearly, but there are certain moments that feel frozen in my mind. It was the 4th of July, And like many families across the United States, we planned to watch fireworks. We drove to a riverbank where people often gathered for celebrations. I remember the air feeling warm and thick with that summer smell of water and dry grass. Families were setting up blankets, coolers, and folding chairs. Kids were running around, excited for the show. At 4 years old, everything feels bigger and brighter. I remember holding one of my parents' hands and looking out at the sky, waiting for the fireworks to start. There was laughter and chatter all around us. It felt safe. It felt normal. No one there could have imagined how quickly things could change. After some time, we began to hear loud popping sounds. At first, I thought the fireworks had started and that we just could not see them yet. The sound echoed across the water. I remember looking up at the sky, expecting to see colors bursting overhead. But there were no lights, just the noise. My parents reacted differently. They recognized something about the sound that I could not. The pops were sharper than fireworks. There was a rhythm to them that did not feel celebratory. I remember seeing the look on their faces shift from relaxed to alert. They did not panic loudly, but they moved quickly. One of them picked me up. The others started gathering our things faster than before. They told us we had to leave. I did not understand why. I was disappointed because I thought we were about to miss the fireworks. But as we moved away from the riverbank, I could still hear the popping sounds in the distance. Later, I learned that some people had decided to fire guns into the air as part of their celebration. To them, it might have felt harmless in the moment, but bullets that go up have to come down. We went home. I probably fell asleep that night, not fully understanding what had happened. At 4 years old, your world is small and protected. You trust the adults around you to handle danger. The next day, everything felt different. My parents were quiet. I remember them reading the newspaper, their faces serious. They did not explain much to me at the time, but as I grew older, they told me what had happened. About an hour after we left that riverbank, a little girl my age had been standing in almost the exact same spot. A bullet fired into the air had come back down and struck her in the head. She died from that injury. The people responsible were eventually charged, but that did not bring her back. The idea that I was only 1 hour away from being in that exact position still unsettles me. 1 hour. That is less time than most families spend watching a movie together. If my parents had not recognized the sound of gunshots, if they had brushed it off as fireworks, I might not be here. When I think about it now as an adult, it feels surreal. At 4 years old, I had no awareness of how fragile life can be. But looking back, I understand that sometimes survival comes down to small decisions made in seconds. My parents heard something was wrong and acted. That instinct changed the course of my life. The older I get, the more that story feels heavy. I think about that little girl and her family. They probably went to the riverbank for the same reason we did. To celebrate, to watch fireworks, to enjoy the night. They had no way of knowing that someone else's reckless choice would cost them everything. It also changed the way I think about celebrations. Firing guns into the air is sometimes treated like a harmless tradition in certain places. But gravity does not care about tradition. Bullets fall with deadly force. That night, a celebration turned into a tragedy because of a few careless decisions. Another story that affected me happened years later in Texas, where I was living at the time. This one was not personal in the same way, but it took place in the same area where I lived, which made it feel closer than news from far away. From what I remember, a couple had been drinking heavily. They got into their car, which already sets a dangerous tone. At some point during the night, they encountered a man. The details of how the confrontation began were disturbing and confusing. Somehow they managed to attach him to the outside of their vehicle by one hand. Whether it was intentional cruelty or a reckless attempt at intimidation, it quickly turned into something far worse. They drove off. What followed was horrific. The man was dragged behind the vehicle for miles at high speed. The road tore at his body. There was no chance of survival. It was a brutal and prolonged death. By the time authorities responded, it was too late. When I first heard about it, I felt sick. Not just because of the violence, but because it happened in a place I recognized. Roads I might have driven on. Streets I might have passed without knowing what had occurred there. Both of these stories share something in common. They involve ordinary moments turning deadly because of reckless or violent decisions. In one case, it was people shooting guns into the air without thinking about where those bullets would land. In the other, it was alcohol-fueled cruelty escalating into murder. It is unsettling to realize how thin the line can be between safety and tragedy. 1 hour, one reckless action, one bad decision. That is sometimes all it takes. I think about how easily my life could have ended before it even truly began. I think about how that little girl's family had their future erased in a single second. I think about the man dragged down a Texas road and how quickly his life was reduced to a headline. These stories are not just shocking because of the violence. They are disturbing because they reveal how vulnerable we all are to other people's choices. You can be sitting peacefully by a riverbank, celebrating with your family, and someone else's irresponsibility can change everything. You can be walking near your own neighborhood and cross paths with people who have no regard for human life. As I have grown older, these experiences have shaped how I move through the world. I pay attention to sounds. I trust my instincts more. I do not dismiss small warning signs. And I have a deeper appreciation for the quiet, ordinary days that pass without incident. It is strange to carry the knowledge that your life was spared by something as simple as leaving an hour early. It creates a quiet gratitude, but also a lingering discomfort. Survival sometimes feels random. Whenever I hear fireworks now, I still think about that night in California. I still think about the difference between a celebration and a tragedy. And whenever I drive down a long stretch of road in Texas, I sometimes remember that second story and how quickly human cruelty can turn a road into a crime scene. Life can feel solid and predictable most days. But these memories remind me that it is also fragile. And sometimes the difference between being here and not being here is measured in minutes. One warm afternoon, in a quiet little town where nothing especially unusual ever seemed to happen, a small lemonade stand sat at the corner of a park. The stand was simple. It was made of wood, painted in light yellow with a handwritten sign that read, "Fresh homemade lemonade." Behind the stand stood a man who had spent the morning squeezing lemons, mixing sugar, and filling pitchers with ice-cold drinks. He was proud of his lemonade. It was sweet, but not too sweet, tart, but refreshing, and perfect for a sunny day. Business was steady, but calm. A few kids had stopped by earlier. A couple walking their dog had each bought a glass. The man was wiping down the counter and thinking about how nice the day was when he heard a soft, rhythmic sound coming down the sidewalk. Waddle, waddle. He looked up and saw a duck approaching. Now, a duck walking through town was not entirely strange. There was a small pond in the park nearby, and ducks often wandered around looking for crumbs or friendly faces. This duck, however, had a certain confidence in the way he moved. He walked straight up to the stand, looked at the man, and said in a clear, curious voice, "Hey, got any grapes?" The man blinked. Of all the things he expected to hear that afternoon, that was not one of them. "No," the man replied politely. "We just sell lemonade. It's cold, it's fresh, and it's homemade. Would you like a glass?" The duck tilted his head slightly, thought for a second, and said, "I'll pass." Then he turned and waddled away. The man stood there for a moment, slightly confused, but not upset. It was a strange interaction, sure, but harmless. He shrugged and went back to arranging cups on the counter. After all, it was just a duck. The next day was just as sunny. The man opened his stand again, filled his pitchers, and waited for customers. A few people stopped by. Everything felt normal. Then he heard it again. Waddle, waddle. The same duck approached the stand, stopped in front of it, and said, "Hey, got any grapes?" The man stared at him for a moment before answering. "No," he said, trying to stay patient. "Like I told you yesterday, we only sell lemonade. That's it. Why not try a glass? It's really good." The duck gave a small nod as if considering the offer. Then he said, "Goodbye," and he waddled away again. Now the man was slightly annoyed, but he tried not to let it bother him. Maybe the duck just did not understand. Maybe he really liked grapes. The man had never thought about selling grapes before. His stand was built for lemonade. That was his business. On the third day, the pattern repeated itself. The duck came walking down the sidewalk with the same steady rhythm. The man saw him from a distance and already knew what was coming. The duck stopped at the counter and said, "Hey, got any grapes?" The man let out a small sigh. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "this is getting old. Lemonade is all we've ever sold. We don't have grapes. We've never had grapes. We probably will not have grapes. Why not just try some lemonade?" The duck paused for a second and then replied, "How about no?" And off he went again, waddling down the sidewalk without a care in the world. At this point, the lemonade man started to feel something deeper than confusion. He felt frustrated. Every day, the same question. Every day, the same answer. And every day, the duck left without buying anything. The fourth day arrived, and the sun was even brighter than before. The lemonade man was already on edge. He had barely finished setting up when he heard the familiar footsteps. Waddle, waddle. The duck approached and without hesitation asked again, "Hey, got any grapes?" That was it. The man's patience snapped. "That's it," he shouted. "If you ask me that one more time, I'll glue you to a tree and leave you there all day. We do not have grapes. We sell lemonade. Stay away if you're not going to buy anything." The duck looked at him calmly and said, "Adios." Then he turned and waddled away once more. The man felt a mix of anger and disbelief. He could not understand why the duck kept coming back. It was not like the answer was going to change. He wondered if the duck was trying to annoy him on purpose. The next day, the man stood at his stand with folded arms, almost daring the duck to show up again. And sure enough, the small white figure appeared at the end of the sidewalk. "Waddle, waddle." The duck walked up and said, "Hey, got any glue?" The man blinked, confused by the change in question. "What? Got any glue?" the duck repeated. "No," the man said slowly. "Why would I have glue? This is a lemonade stand." The duck nodded thoughtfully. "One more question," he said. "Got any grapes?" There was a long pause. Something shifted in the man's expression. Instead of anger, something else rose to the surface. He stopped, stared at the duck, and then suddenly started to smile. The whole situation felt ridiculous. a duck asking for grapes at a lemonade stand. Day after day, it was absurd. Then he started to laugh. At first, it was a small laugh, but it grew. He laughed at the repetition, at his own frustration, at the duck's persistence. He laughed for longer than he expected. The tension that had been building over several days finally broke. When he caught his breath, he looked at the duck and said, "Come on, let's walk to the store. I'll buy you some grapes so you don't have to ask me anymore." The duck nodded, as if this had been the goal all along. They walked together down the sidewalk, an unusual pair. A lemonade stand owner and a duck heading to the local grocery store. People passing by looked twice but did not say anything. Inside the store, the man bought a bag of fresh grapes. He paid for them and brought them outside. See, he handed one to the duck. The duck looked at it carefully. The duck said. "No thanks." The man's eyes widened. "You have got to be kidding me." The duck continued calmly. "But you know what sounds good? It would make my day. Do you think this store has any lemonade?" For a second, the man just stared at him. Then the duck turned and waddled away again, leaving the man standing there with a bag of grapes in his hand. The whole story, simple as it sounds, carries something deeper. The duck never forced the man to sell grapes. He never demanded anything. He just kept asking the same question, calmly and confidently. The man, on the other hand, went through every emotional stage possible. Confusion, mild annoyance, frustration, anger, then finally laughter. The duck's persistence was almost playful. He did not yell. He did not argue. He simply returned each day and asked the same question. Sometimes in life, repetition can wear people down. Sometimes it can build tension. But sometimes, if you step back far enough, it can become funny. The lemonade man learned that not every interruption is a threat. Not every annoyance needs to turn into anger. Sometimes the situation is so ridiculous that the only healthy response is to laugh. As for the duck, he never seemed stressed. He never seemed worried about whether he would get grapes or lemonade. He just kept waddling forward, asking his question, and moving on. And somewhere in that quiet little town, on a sunny corner near a park, a lemonade stand owner learned that patience and humor can sometimes turn frustration into a story you tell for years afterward. Meanwhile, the duck, he just kept waddling. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.